The cowboy didn't stop the wedding because he hated her. He stopped it because of what she whispered before saying, "I do." Rain hammered the church roof as Lorraine's wedding ring slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wooden floor with a sharp, metallic crack. Half the town turned to stare. Then Colt Mercer stepped forward through the silence, mud still on his boots, his jaw tight like he'd ridden through hell to get there. But when Lorraine looked at him, she suddenly forgot how to breathe. If stories like this still pull at your heart, stay with me till the end. The wind always came early to Dust Hollow. By late October, it slipped down from the gray Montana hills before sunset, dragging dust through the streets and rattling every loose sign in town. Folks pulled their coats tighter. Horses lowered their heads against it. The old church windows groaned whenever the gusts hit hard enough. Lorraine Brooks stood near the back wall of the fellowship hall, with a tin cup of weak coffee cooling between her hands. The church social smelled like cinnamon bread, lamp oil, damp wool, and smoke drifting in from the cook fires outside. Someone near the front played a fiddle too fast. Boots scraped across the wooden floor while couples laughed under strings of yellow lantern light. Nobody had asked Lorraine to dance. Nobody ever did anymore. Two younger women stood near the pie table, whispering behind gloved hands. Lorraine recognized them immediately. Clara Bennett and June Holloway, barely 20, both wearing bright ribbons in their hair like they still believed life was something waiting to begin. Clara glanced toward Lorraine first. Then came the laugh. "Cowboys want young girls," she said softly, though not soft enough. "Not women carrying ghosts." June covered her mouth, trying not to choke on her cider. Lorraine looked down at her coffee cup. The liquid trembled slightly from the music, vibrating through the floorboards. She did not cry, did not react. After a moment, she set the untouched coffee beside a stack of hymn books and quietly reached for her coat hanging near the door. Outside, the cold hit hard. Dust Hollow stretched beneath the darkening sky, like a town too tired to keep pretending. The hotel porch sagged in the middle. The barber pole squeaked in the wind. Somewhere farther down Main Street, a drunk man argued beside the saloon hitch rail. Lorraine pulled her scarf tighter and started walking. The fiddle music faded behind her. So did the laughter. Her sewing shop sat near the old stagecoach depot, at the far end of town, where fewer people bothered to walk after sunset. A narrow building with faded blue paint and crooked windows. The sign above the door read, "Brooks Alterations and Mending." Some letters had nearly disappeared from years of snow and dust. A light still burned inside. Martha Keene had left a paper sack hanging from the doorknob. Fresh bread, still warm. Lorraine smiled faintly despite herself. Martha never knocked anymore. Just left food when she thought Lorraine had forgotten to eat. Inside, the little shop smelled like fabric, soap, and cedar wood. Shelves lined the walls holding folded cloth, thread spools, old receipts tied with twine, and sewing patterns worn soft at the edges. Lorraine locked the door behind her. The silence settled slowly. She removed her gloves and sat beside the oil lamp near the front window. A pair of ranch pants waited half-finished beneath the needle of her sewing machine. Beside them sat a small ledger with unpaid balances written in careful ink. $2 from the Miller Ranch, 75 cents from the widow Parker. 3 months overdue. Lorraine dipped her pen again and kept working. Outside, wind rattled the loose hitching post. Then came the sound. Crack, glass shattered across the floor. Lorraine jerked upright. A stone rolled across the wooden boards
Around her feet.
For 1 second, everything went still. Then she saw the paint. White letters streaked across the front door. "Too old for love." The words dripped slowly beneath the lantern light. Lorraine stared at them without moving outside. Distant laughter disappeared into the wind. She set the pen down carefully, walked to the wash basin, dipped a rag into cold water, and began scrubbing. The paint smeared first before it faded. White streaks spread across the wood like old scars refusing to disappear cleanly. The water turned cloudy, Her fingers stiffened from cold. Hour after hour, she kept wiping. The oil lamp burned lower. By midnight, her shoulders ached. By 2 in the morning, the words had mostly vanished, except for faint pale shadows buried in the grain of the wood. Lorraine sat back on her heels. The rag hung limp in her hand. Outside, snow had started falling lightly over Dust Hollow. She looked through the front window toward the empty street. No tears came, just exhaustion. She finally climbed the narrow staircase behind the shop shortly before dawn. The room upstairs held little more than a bed, a washstand, a Bible, and a framed photograph turned face down inside a drawer she rarely opened anymore. She removed her boots slowly, lay down fully dressed, and listened to the wind scrape against the walls until sleep finally took her. The next morning arrived, pale and bitter cold. Lorraine opened the shop just after sunrise. Her hands still smelled faintly of paint thinner and soap. She swept broken glass into a bucket near the door while frost clung to the windows. Around mid-morning, Sheriff Doyle passed by outside. He slowed when he noticed the damaged glass. Their eyes met briefly. He tipped his hat once, then kept walking. Lorraine watched him disappear through the drifting snow. Not long after that, another sound reached the street. Horse hooves, slow, heavy, unhurried. A dark gelding stopped outside the shop. Lorraine glanced up automatically. The rider swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion. Tall man, broad shoulders beneath a weather-beaten coat. Snow dusted the brim of his black hat. He tied the reins loosely before stepping toward the door. For a second, Lorraine braced herself for the usual look: pity, curiosity. That careful expression people wore around broken things. But when the cowboy stepped inside, brushing cold air and snow into the room with him, he simply looked at her the way a man looked at another human being. Nothing more, nothing less. Then his gaze moved toward the sign hanging above her work table. Lorraine Brooks, he read quietly. His voice was rough like gravel roads after rain. He removed his gloves slowly. I hear you're the best seamstress in Dust Hollow. Lorraine stared at him for one long second, then finally answered, That depends who's asking. A corner of the cowboy's mouth moved almost into a smile. Name's Colt Mercer. And somehow, without understanding why, Lorraine felt the room grow slightly warmer. Snow tapped softly against the front window, while the cowboy stood near the door, holding a dark wool coat over one arm. The sleeve had ripped almost clean through near the shoulder seam. Lorraine wiped her hands slowly on her apron. You planning to mend that, she asked. Or bury somebody in it? Colt glanced down at the coat. Depends how much you charge. That almost sounded like humor. Almost. Lorraine motioned toward the counter beneath the lamp. Colt crossed the room with heavy bootsteps, softened by the old rug near the sewing machine. He removed his hat when he sat down. Most men in Dust Hollow forgot manners unless a preacher was nearby. Lorraine noticed that. She noticed other things, too. The scrape along his knuckles, the stiffness in his left shoulder, the faint smell of smoke and horses clinging to his coat. She lifted the torn fabric carefully. Beneath the ripped wool, his shirt sleeve was stained faint brown with dried blood. You should had that looked at. Colt shrugged once. Horse kicked the fence loose during the hailstorm Tuesday. Hailstorm was 3 days ago. Been busy. Lorraine threaded a needle beneath the lamp. Outside, wagon wheels rolled somewhere down the frozen street. A dog barked twice near the depot. For a while, neither of them spoke. It should felt awkward. Instead, the silence settled easy between them. You own the ranch up near Black Ash Ridge? Lorraine finally asked. Colt nodded. Bought it in September. The old Bennett place? That's the one. Lorraine looked up briefly. Most folks say that land's cursed. Most folks around here say a lot. A small sound escaped her before she could stop it. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that Colt noticed. His eyes shifted toward her then. Steady eyes, gray like Winter Creek water. Not pitying, not curious, just paying attention. That alone made Lorraine uneasy. Men usually looked through her these days. Or worse, at her like she belonged to some sad story already finished. Colt looked at her like she was still happening. She bent back over the stitching quickly. "You staying in town long?" she asked. "No. Then why buy land here? Needed someplace quiet." Lorraine tied off the thread with her teeth. "Well," she murmured, "you picked the wrong town for peace." That earned a real smile this time. Small, crooked, gone almost immediately. By noon, the snow thickened outside. The wind dragged white sheets across Main Street until half the buildings disappeared behind drifting powder. Colt stood near the stove while Lorraine wrapped his repaired coat in brown paper. "How much?" $20. He reached into his pocket, laid $2 silver on the counter. "I don't have change." "Keep it." Lorraine frowned instantly. "I'm not charity." "I know." His answer came quick, calm. That wasn't charity. For 1 second, the room went completely still. Then Colt picked up the coat. "Appreciate the work, Miss Brooks." "Lorraine's fine." He nodded once. "Lorraine." The way he said her name sounded careful somehow, like he didn't throw words around unless he meant them. After he left, Lorraine stood near the window longer than necessary, watching him mount his horse. Big, dark gelding, worn saddle, bedroll tied behind it with fresh rope, a man who traveled light. Martha Keene arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a tray of apple turnovers beneath a dish towel. She stopped the second she noticed Lorraine still staring outside. "Well now," Martha said carefully. "Who was that?" "Customer." That cowboy looked at this shop, like he intended to come back. Lorraine took the tray from her before the older woman could see color rising in her face. "He needed a coat fixed." "Mm-hmm." Martha moved toward the stove, warming her hands. "Folks already talking about him." "Dust Hollow talks about everybody." "Yes, but they are especially interested in him." Martha lowered her voice slightly. "Gideon Pike's been sniffing around that Black Ash property for months. Railroad surveyors came through summer before last. Folks think a supply route may cut near the ridge eventually." Lorraine's expression tightened slightly. "And Gideon wants the land. Gideon wants all land." That much was true. By evening, the storm had worsened. Lorraine was closing the shutters when another knock came against the door. She opened it, expecting Martha again. Instead, Colt stood outside, holding an armload of split firewood dusted white with snow. Lorraine blinked. "You forgot this morning gets colder after dark," he said simply. Before she could answer, he carried the wood inside and stacked it neatly beside the stove. No speech, no grin, no expectation, just quiet usefulness. "You don't have to keep paying me extra," Lorraine said softly. Colt straightened slowly. "Ain't payment." The wind howled outside the shop windows. For a second, neither moved. Then Colt noticed the faint pale streaks still visible across the front door, where the paint had been scrubbed away. Too old for love. Most people pretended not to see it. He didn't. His jaw tightened slightly. "Who did that?" Lorraine busied herself adjusting the kettle. "Kids, probably. Kids don't usually buy paint." She looked at him then. Really looked. Something in his face told her he understood more than he said aloud. That unsettled her worse than cruelty ever had. "I cleaned it already," she said quietly. Colt stared at the door another second before nodding once. Then he reached for his gloves. "I'll see you around, Lorraine." Outside, snow whipped around him as he crossed the street toward his horse. Lorraine stood alone in the warm little shop, listening to the kettle begin to whistle softly over the stove. For the first time in years, the silence around her didn't feel quite so empty. And somewhere deep down, buried beneath all the careful loneliness she'd spent years building, something dangerous began to move. The next morning came hard and gray over Dust Hollow. Wind pushed dust and old snow through the crooked street, while Lorraine unlocked the front door of the shop with stiff fingers. The bell above the frame rattled softly as she stepped inside. The room still smelled faintly of cedar smoke from the firewood Colt had brought. She hated that she noticed it, hated even more that she left one split log untouched beside the stove. By noon, the town had started moving again. Wagons creaked past the feed store, Horses stamped outside the saloon. Somewhere near the depot, a hammer rang against metal. Lorraine sat behind the sewing machine, hemming a heavy canvas coat, when the bell over the door sounded again. Colt Mercer ducked inside, carrying a paper sack under one arm. "You forgot something?" Lorraine asked without looking up. "Maybe." She lifted her eyes carefully. He placed the sack on the counter. Flour dust clung faintly to the bottom. "Martha said you skipped breakfast." Lorraine frowned immediately. "Martha talks too much. She baked too much, too." Colt nudged the sack toward her. "Figured somebody ought to help." Inside were 2 still-warm biscuits wrapped in cloth and a small tin of blackberry jam. Lorraine stared at them longer than necessary. "You ride all the way into town to deliver biscuits?" "Needed nails from the hardware store." "And the biscuits?" Colt removed his gloves slowly. "Seemed rude eating both myself." That almost made her smile again. Almost. Outside, a freight wagon rolled through muddy ruts, splashing slush against the boardwalk. Colt wandered slowly through the shop, while Lorraine folded the cloth back over the biscuits. His gaze stopped near the back wall, where finished dresses hung beneath the window. "You make all these?" "I try to." He touched the sleeve of a dark green riding coat carefully, like he wasn't used to touching delicate things. "My mother used to sew," he said quietly. Lorraine looked up. "She passed 10 years ago." "I'm sorry." Colt nodded once. Silence settled again, softer this time. Then he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and set it awkwardly on the counter. Lorraine unfolded it carefully. Numbers, feed costs, fence repairs, half the words misspelled. "You want help with bookkeeping." Colt scratched lightly at his jaw, almost embarrassed. "Banker in Miles City says my records look like they got kicked down a hill." Lorraine glanced at him over the page. "You asking me to save your ranch?" "Just asking you to read my handwriting." The corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. By late afternoon, Lorraine sat beside him at the counter, explaining supply totals while Colt listened with quiet focus. He leaned close sometimes to follow her pencil marks. Every now and then, their sleeves brushed lightly. Neither mentioned it. When he finally stood to leave, the winter sun had already dropped behind the hills. "You charging me for this too?" he asked. "You can pay me next week. That trust or pity?" Lorraine met his eyes. Neither. Something unreadable crossed his face then. Outside, cold air swept through the doorway as Colt settled his hat back onto his head. "Road up to Black Ash gets rough after dark," Lorraine said before thinking. Colt paused. "You worried about me, Miss Brooks?" She folded her arms quickly. "I'm worried you'll die owing me money." A low laugh escaped him. Real this time. Warm enough to stay with her long after he rode away. 3 days later, the first heavy snowstorm hit Dust Hollow. Wind screamed across the valley before sunset. Stable doors slammed open. Lanterns swung wildly outside the saloon. Folks hurried home with scarves pulled high over their faces. Lorraine stayed late securing fabric rolls inside the shop. The old roof leaked near the back room whenever snow piled too heavily. She dragged a canvas tarp toward the alley behind the stable, fighting the wind with numb hands. The cold cut straight through her gloves. One corner snapped loose, then another. The next thing she knew, the world tilted strangely beneath her feet. White snow, sharp wind, darkness folding inward. Far away, she thought she heard horses, then arms, strong arms lifting her from the frozen ground. "Lorraine," a voice roughened by panic. "Stay with me." She drifted in and out after that, the violent sway of a horse beneath her. Snow striking somebody's coat, one hand holding her tightly against a broad chest, while the storm swallowed the road behind them. By the time Dust Hollow saw Colt Mercer ride through town, carrying Lorraine Brooks in his arms beneath his heavy ranch coat, half the lamps along Main Street had already gone dark for the night. People watched from windows, from porches, from behind curtains. No one spoke, not even the women who used to whisper when Lorraine walked past church on Sundays, because the way Colt held her made one thing painfully clear. He wasn't carrying her out of pity. He was carrying her like losing her would break something inside him. And by morning, the rumors had already spread across every inch of the Dust Hollow. The Cowboy's fallen for the old widow. Lorraine heard it before she even reached the mercantile. Two ranch hands stood beside the water trough with steaming coffee cups in their hands. They stopped talking the moment she passed. One of them tipped his hat awkwardly. The other smirked into his drink. Lorraine kept walking. Fresh snow cracked beneath her boots, while church bells rang faint and hollow through the cold morning air. By noon, the whole town seemed to be watching her. Watching Colt, too. He came into her shop later carrying fence wire over one shoulder and a bruise darkening along his jaw from some ranch accident he refused to explain. "You hear the gossip yet?" Lorraine asked quietly, while measuring cloth behind the counter. Colt set the wire down. "Heard worse. It'll get uglier, probably." The calm way he said it unsettled her more than anger would have. Outside, wind rattled the wooden signs along Main Street. Somewhere near the train depot, a dog barked endlessly. Colt removed his gloves slowly. "You care what they think?" Lorraine folded the measuring tape carefully before answering. "I care what people do when they think they're right." That made him still for a second. Because they both knew Dust Hollow had never needed much excuse to turn cruel. 3 days later, Gideon Pike arrived. He stepped into Lorraine's shop, smelling of cigars and winter leather, carrying a stack of folded papers beneath one arm. Lorraine already knew trouble before he opened his mouth. Gideon smiled too easily. "Morning, Miss Brooks. I was having one." He ignored that. "These buildings along Mercer Street are changing ownership soon." He laid the papers across her counter, including this one. Lorraine stared down at the documents. Old debts. Property liens. Signatures from men dead nearly 15 years. Her landlord had sold everything quietly before leaving Montana Territory. "You have 30 days, Gideon said. "After that, demolition starts." Lorraine lifted her eyes slowly. "You bought half the street just to tear it down? Railroad expansion's coming." Gideon straightened his coat cuffs. "Old things make room for profitable things." His gaze drifted around the tiny sewing shop, then back to her. "Some folks do too." The bell above the door rang softly as he left. Lorraine stood frozen long after the sound disappeared. That evening she packed in silence. Fabric first, then account books, then the framed photograph of her parents she kept wrapped carefully in cloth beneath the register drawer. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof edges. She planned to leave on the midnight freight wagon, heading west toward Helena. No goodbyes, no pity, just gone. But Colt noticed. He arrived near dusk and stopped short the moment he stepped inside. Shelves half empty, crates near the door, the old sewing machine covered already. His face hardened immediately. "You leaving?" Lorraine kept folding fabric. "It's not your concern. It became my concern when Pike started circling your shop like a vulture." She finally looked at him then. "I can handle myself." "I know you can. Then let me." Colt stepped closer, snow melting off his coat onto the wooden floorboards. "Come up to the ranch." Lorraine shook her head instantly. "No, you won't survive winter alone out there." "I've survived worse. I ain't doubting that." His voice softened then. "Stay anyway." Something dangerous moved through the silence between them. Lorraine looked away first. "You don't understand what people become around women like me." Colt frowned slightly. "Women like you. Women folks already decided are finished." The words hung heavy in the room. Colt's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, shouting erupted outside. Then glass shattered. Lorraine spun toward the window just as a rock crashed through the front pane. Another hit the door. Men laughing outside. "Drunk! Cruel!" one voice shouted from the street. "Town's moving on, widow!" Another rock slammed against the wall. Colt moved instantly. By the time Lorraine reached the door, he was already out in the muddy street, grabbing one man by the coat collar, while the others backed away fast. The fight was short, ugly, mostly mud and fists and rage buried too deep for words. Sheriff Doyle finally dragged the men apart beneath the yellow glow of the street lanterns. But the damage had already been done. The next morning, the bank withdrew Colt's ranch loan. Folk stopped speaking when he entered rooms, and Lorraine realized the town had decided something for both of them. Neither belonged anymore. Rain fell hard 2 nights later, when Colt arrived at the shop again. He stood in the doorway, soaked through, hat dripping onto the floorboards. Lorraine looked up from the last crate she was packing. Colt didn't sit down, didn't remove his gloves. He simply said quietly, "If they want a reason to hate us," then he stepped closer. "Let's give them one worth remembering." Lorraine stared at him. The storm beat against the windows. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then very softly, almost afraid of the answer, she asked, "You proposing to me, Colt Mercer?" His eyes held hers steady. "I'm asking you not to disappear." And somewhere deep inside her, the lonely part she had protected for years finally began to break open. "I'm asking you not to disappear." And somewhere deep inside her, the lonely part she had protected for years finally began to break open. Lorraine looked down at her hands. Needle scars, faded burns from old irons, a thin silver widow's ring she had stopped noticing years ago. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while Colt stood waiting in the middle of the shop, like a man prepared to hear no and stay anyway. "You don't even know what living with me would be like," she said quietly. Colt gave a tired shrug. "I know what it's like without you." The words settled into the room softer than thunder. That frightened her more. Outside, wagon wheels rolled through wet mud. Somewhere farther down Main Street, piano music drifted weakly from the saloon before disappearing into the storm. Lorraine turned away first. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why?" "Because people start believing them." Colt stepped closer, slow enough to give her space to move away. She didn't. "You think I care what this town believes?" he asked. "I think you will when it costs you everything." His jaw shifted slightly. Too late for that, his silence seemed to say. 3 mornings later, the church bells rang under a gray sky. Not many people came. Martha Keene sat in the front pew, holding a handkerchief in both hands, while Sheriff Doyle remained stiff near the back wall beside the pot-belly stove. Rainwater slid down the church windows in crooked lines. Lorraine stood near the altar wearing a simple brown dress beneath her wool coat. No veil, no flowers, nothing soft enough to feel like a dream. Colt waited beside her in his dark trail jacket, one sleeve still poorly stitched where barbed wire had torn it weeks earlier. Pastor Reed cleared his throat twice before beginning. Even he seemed nervous, because outside those church, Dust Hollow was already talking. Some called it shame, others called it desperation, a few called it madness. But nobody inside that little church mistook what sat between Colt and Lorraine when their eyes met. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't rescue. It looked too tired for romance, too steady for fantasy. It looked like 2 lonely people finally setting down something heavy. When Pastor Reed asked for the ring, Colt reached slowly into his pocket. The band was simple silver, rough around the edges. "My mama's saddle stirrup," he explained quietly. "Melted it down years ago." Lorraine stared at the ring in silence before offering her hand. His fingers trembled once while sliding it onto hers. Only once. Afterward, no music played, no cheering came. Just rain on the roof and the low creak of old wooden pews as people stood to leave. Martha hugged Lorraine tightly near the church door. "You come by the bakery tomorrow," she whispered. "I'm making peach bread." Lorraine laughed softly through her nerves. "Yes, Mom." Outside, mud covered the street ankle-deep. Colt opened the wagon door for her carefully. Across the road, Gideon Pike watched from beneath the awning of the barber shop, hat low, cigar glowing faintly. He smiled when Colt noticed him. Not kindly. That night, the ranch house felt strangely quiet. Black Ash Ridge disappeared beneath heavy fog while cold rain rattled against the cabin roof. The house itself was sturdy but worn. Old horseshoes hung beside the front door. A lantern burned low near the kitchen stove. Colt's boots sat drying, beside folded saddle blankets. Lorraine stood awkwardly in the small upstairs room he had prepared for her. A clean quilt rested across the narrow bed. Fresh water waited in a basin beside the washstand, and near the window sat a small vase holding dried prairie flowers. She touched them carefully. "You did this?" she asked when Colt appeared quietly in the doorway. His eyes moved toward the flowers. "Martha did." Lorraine smiled faintly. Of course she had. Colt rested one shoulder against the frame, keeping respectful distance between them. "There's extra firewood downstairs if you get cold." "I'll be fine." A pause, then another. Neither seemed sure what belonged to them now. Finally, Colt nodded once. "Good night, Lorraine." "Good night." He started downstairs, then stopped halfway. "The lock sticks some," he said without turning around. "So, if the wind picks up tonight, don't worry if you hear me outside fixing it." Lorraine listened to his boots disappear below. Hours later, she woke to violent wind, hammering the cabin walls. Rain forced itself through cracks near the window frame. Somewhere outside, loose shutters slammed hard against wood. Then came the sound of hammering, slow, steady. She stepped quietly to the window. Below, beneath cold lantern light and pouring rain, Colt stood outside, fastening extra boards across the upstairs shutters with numb hands. Not because the storm threatened him, because it threatened her. Lorraine rested her fingers lightly against the glass, and for the first time since becoming a widow, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to belong somewhere again. Maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the fire, not the gossip, not even the wedding beneath that rain-soaked church roof. Maybe it's the quiet things. A man fixing a window in the middle of the night because he knows the wind keeps someone awake. A woman learning how to sit beside another soul without expecting to be left behind. Two tired people finding warmth in a world that had gone cold on them years earlier. And if you've ever carried loneliness so long, it started feeling like part of your skin, then maybe you understand Lorraine a little better than you think. Because sometimes life doesn't hand us love when we're young and fearless. Sometimes it waits until we've been bruised by loss, humbled by time, and nearly convinced we're too far gone to be chosen. Yet somehow, the human heart keeps reaching anyway. That may be the real miracle hidden inside old Western towns like Dust Hollow. Not survival, but the courage to trust tenderness one more time. If this story reminded you of someone you once loved, or someone you lost, tell me their name in the comments below. And if you'd like, stay a while longer on this trail with me. There are still more stories waiting out there beneath the mountain wind. Stories about love, second chances, and the kind of people this world almost forgets.